Okay, this one's from the website bibliotecapleiades.net, and this is Densities from the Cassiopeia website. Stand by.
Density. In the Cassiopeia and raw materials, density denotes a qualitatively distinct level of being. Each density has its own structure of life forms, perception, and typical lessons for the consciousnesses residing in it. Densities are defined roughly as follows. First density, inanimate matter. If we can speak of learning here, the lesson is maybe for matter to learn to combine in ways forming primitive biological organisms. Second density, vegetal and animal kingdom lessons have to do with biological life, survival, adaptation, competition, group organization as seen with animals and the like. The soul structure is generally a species soul pool, but as species become more advanced, individual members of the species may differentiate themselves by more varied individual learning. Third density, human lessons of second density continue in more complex forms, as in battles for social domination, more survival, etc. Individually acquired personality and individual learning play a greater role than in second density. Humans are divided into pre-atomics, who share a species-like soul pool, and atomics, who have an individuated soul. The specific lesson of third density is, however, making a choice of orientation of service, towards service to others in its greatest possible manifestation, or service to self in its greatest possible manifestation. Making such a conscious choice requires having an individuated soul, and presumably a large number of lifetimes in third density for the soul to acquire its polarity. Fourth density. This is described as a partly physical state where graduates of third density may deepen and perfect their chosen polarity. STS and SDO groups are distinct in fourth density and do not automatically come in contact, unless in the context of interacting with third density. Most of the UFO phenomenon involves fourth density service to self beings. Pure service to self may not occur past the fourth level of density, presumably because this is the last at least partly material density. Fourth density beings enjoy more conscious control over physicality and generally form groups telepathically sharing a common pool of experience while retaining a certain individuality. Fifth density souls of first through fourth density find themselves in fifth density between incarnations. This is a contemplation zone where these souls may observe their past future lives from a purely ethereal state of being. However, for progress to be realized, the souls must incarnate in the density which best corresponds to their level of progress. Sixth density. This corresponds to the level of names of God or unified thought forms. Service to others entities who no longer need to reincarnate occupy this level. This corresponds to angels or dionic beings in other terminologies. Seventh density. This is the level where all is one and one is all, in a practical, real and meaningful sense. There is no longer any difference between thought and reality. This corresponds to a notion of all-encompassing God or universe or the Son absolute of the fourth way. The concept is complex and words of third density are not fully appropriate for most aspects of the matter. The raw material offers a somewhat systematic overview of the question. The Cassiopeia material builds further on that basis. There are slight differences of emphasis and definition between the two, but from our standpoint the essential message is that a passage from third to fourth density is in some cases possible and requires first mastering the lessons of third density, specifically survival, karma and formation of a truly individuated being capable of consistent work in one's chosen polarity. The mastery of self spoken of by the fourth way is a subtask of these. The different cosmoses of the fourth way cosmology can be seen to correspond with densities. Direct comparison is difficult because most of this material lies outside human experience. First density. In the scale of densities, the first density corresponds to inanimate matter and energy. Since the scale of density is principally concerned with how awareness interacts with its environment, we could say that the first density is the raw material on which awareness acts in order to create. The Cassiopeia material proposes that absolutely everything, thus including inanimate matter, learns after its own fashion and that there is nothing that would not somehow derive from consciousness. In this sense, the first density could be said to be sleeping consciousness, not structured into organisms or species of living things. As the density gets higher, the entities of said density become more diverse and more alive, holding more aliveness, information or intelligence per entity. We cannot attribute human or animal-like consciousness to inanimate matter. Sheldrake's claims on morphic resonance between crystals could be something akin to learning at the level of the first density. If one particular solution is once made to crystallize, it will crystallize more readily in experiments carried out in separate locations. Claims concerning the memory of water would be another example of learning in the first density. The imprinting of patterns on a solvent through successive dilutions as practiced in preparing homeopathic remedies might be another example. The ultimate learning result of the first density is for matter to learn to form self-replicating organisms, thereby creating life. In the Cassiopeia cosmology, this is not entirely independent of pre-existing consciousness, rather we could say that the consciousness from the future creates its material beginnings in the past. This may take place through various processes, for example manipulating quantum effects at the molecular level in order to promote formation of the building blocks and initial genome for primitive organisms. In the Gurdjieff scale of hydrogens, the first density would correspond to H3072, which is the category of metals and minerals and generally of substances which do not have a biological origin. Second density. In the Cassiopeia scale of densities, the second density corresponds to everything that grows biologically, up to the point where the emphasis in evolution shifts from the biological evolution of a species to the mental and spiritual evolution of an individual seen as distinct from the species. The second density begins with the advent of self-replicating organisms subject to a biological evolution. The line between second and third density is hard to draw with exactitude, but would generally correspond to the separation of modern-type humans from primates. Learning takes place in all densities, and in the second density it primarily takes place at the level of a species adapting to an ecological situation or niche. Still, second density cannot be seen in Darwinian terms only. It is noteworthy that the dividing lines between species are well defined, displaying distinct jumps in sudden species formation rather than smooth transition. Esoteric culture speaks of the existence of species over souls, which would be the non-physical counterpart of an animal species. The physical representation of this oversoul would be the DNA defining the species, and its learning would physically be represented as the biological evolution of this DNA. At the non-physical level, the species oversoul, the effective unit of evolution, undergoes learning through the collective sum of all its incarnations in all the individuals of the species. As the learning capacity of individual members of the species increases, as with higher animals, the emphasis of learning may shift from the genetically transmitted learning of the whole species to what is learned by an individual member of the species and stored in its brain or soul imprint. Thus the soul imprint may become no longer soluble or assimilable into the anonymous soul pool of the species. Thus individual fragments of the species oversoul may become self-conscious and harvestable to third density. The notion of the organic portal further complicates the transition between second and third densities. Also, the emergence of individuated soul cannot be seen in terms of reflexive self-awareness, cognitive or behavioral learning alone. See the Ra quote below. From Ra, questioner, let's take the point at which an individualized entity of second density is ready for transition to third. Is the second density being what we would call animal? Ra, I am Ra. There are three types of second density entities which become, shall we say, inspirated. The first is the animal. This is the most predominant. The second is the vegetable, most especially that which you call, sound vibration complex, tree. These entities are capable of giving and receiving enough love to become individualized. The third is mineral. Occasionally a certain location, place, as you may call it, becomes energized to individuality through the love it receives and gives in relationship to a third density entity, which is in relationship to it. This is the least common transition. Questioner, when this transition from second to third density takes place, how does the entity, whether it be animal, vegetable, tree, or mineral, become inspirated? Ra, I am Ra. Entities do not become inspirated. They become aware of the intelligent energy within each portion, cell, or atom, as you may call it, of its beingness. This awareness is that which is awareness of that already given. From the infinite come all densities. The self-awareness comes from within, given the catalyst of certain experiences, understanding, as we may call this particular energy, the upward spiraling of the cell or atom or consciousness. You may then see that there is an inevitable pull toward the, what you may call, eventual realization of self. From the Cassiopeia material, A, beware, third density STS orientation includes the thought of dominion over second density, and this is merely a continuation of the energy buildups of the approach of the wave. Some of the lessons are interesting indeed. When you assume that capture and imprisonment of those of lesser capacity than you is for the good, why should not you expect those of greater capacity than you to assume the same regarding you? A, what if one on second density perceives objects due to their similarity, one on third density perceives objects due to their difference, and one on fourth density perceives objects in terms of their own union with all of them? QL, is there some way to communicate with whales or dolphins, and can one find a way to translate the differences and have a reasonable, intelligence exchange with a whale or a dolphin or even an elephant? A, you don't need conversation with when a higher telepathic level. QL, dolphins and whales communicate telepathically? A, yes. So do dogs and cats and snakes, etc., etc. Only humans have learned the superior art of verbal communication. In the Gurdjieffan terminology, 1 and 2 brain being constitute second density. The brains in question are also known as moving center and emotional center. All living things have a moving center adapted to the species which regulates its physical processes, whatever these may be. Higher animals further have an emotional center. Both these centers have intelligence in their specific domains but still do not form capacity for abstract thought. This is the hallmark of 3 brain beings, which in Gurdjieff's system of terminology are third density and higher beings. Third density. In the scale of densities, this corresponds to living beings that have a degree of individual consciousness and corresponding free will, at least in potential. This implies that a proper being of third density is a moral entity with attendant responsibilities. While the animal does primarily according to the typical behavior of the species, the third density entity is supposed to have reflexive self-awareness and free will and to be thus accountable in terms of karma and soul evolution. While the lessons of the second density have to do with developing a being that has the beginnings of individual character and individual intelligence as opposed to behavior dictated by species, the lessons of the third density take these further and make the development of a permanent individuated soul possible. To provide catalyst for this direction of development, the human form is physically weaker and less specifically adapted than late second density forms. Also, verbal communication and the need to learn a language are first found in third density. Animals are typically more in tune with their environment and have clearer, if also more specialized interspecies communication. According to the Cs, higher animals live in a sort of telepathically functioning species consciousness. If such exists between humans, it is weaker and less reliable, thus isolating individuals from each other. On the other hand, the relative physical vulnerability of the human form makes cooperation more necessary than with animals in general. This creates an evolutionary setting for developing individual intelligence. The development of individual thinking and distinct personality while functioning in a human society then works as catalyst for developing an individuated soul. This essentially involves a free will choice between serving the self and serving others, which is the quintessential soul evolution choice. This is, however, the province of esoteric work and is not an automatic effect of the mere fact of being a third density being. Gurdjieff refers to man as a three-brain being as opposed to a two-brain being, with which term he designates higher animals. The term refers to man having three centers, i.e. moving, feeling and thinking, while the higher animals have only moving and feeling centers. Thus for Gurdjieff the differentiating factor is in the development of thinking faculties. Steiner looks at the question slightly differently. For Steiner, animals have a physical, etheric and astral body, and man has in addition to these an I. While higher animals appear to have much the same basic emotions as humans, the human form is differentiated by more developed self-awareness or self-reflection. The I is, however, more than the psychological mechanism of self-observation or metacognition. For Steiner, this is a reincarnating entity. The fourth way, on the other hand, sees such an I only as a possibility to be realized by esoteric work. Self-awareness in the psychological sense is useful, but does not in itself make a permanent I. The issue of the third density is further complicated by the concept of the Adamic and pre-Adamic man, also known as the organic portal. According to Moraviev and Cassiopeia, man always has the three lower centers of moving, feeling and thinking but may or may not have the potential for the seating of an individuated soul into the higher centers. The pre-Adamic man is, as it were, the animal equipped with human body and intellect. As such, the pre-Adamic man is a chain in the ladder of soul evolution from the species soul pools of the second density into the individuation of the third. We could say that the place of soul in the pre-Adamic man is occupied by a species or ethnic collective soul. We could also say that the pre-Adamic man mimics the soul functions of individually souled man by sort of absorbing and reflecting higher center energies received from such. The difference is not, however, obvious since psychologically both kinds of man are much the same, the difference being only in the experience of the spiritual or transcendent. The difference is not necessarily in psychic sensitivity since such senses exist also in the second density and can be stronger and more reliable than in the third. As a general rule, the emotional makeup of one becomes more conscious along the journey through the third density. The basic patterns of pain, pleasure, instinctive like and dislike, territoriality, stress reactions, bonding to mate or pack, sense of hierarchy, primitive grief and such, carried over from late second density continue to exist. These are largely automatic and get their basic pattern from imprinting. These may, however, be less hardwired and more amenable to shaping by the person's self than in the animal form. The presence of emotions should not be confused with soul development. On the other hand, as Moraviev teaches, the more refined or intelligent emotions, such as altruistic love, respect of free will, sense of holiness or mystery, drive for seeking the spiritual, sense of personal integrity and the like may bridge between the lower and the higher. We could say that these can be attributes of the individuated soul being formed. On the other hand, it seems that an individuated soul may also be formed on the basis of a pervasive need to control, which would correspond to the STS polarization. In either case, the entity chooses which emotions to develop and which not to express. The notion of the two types of man simply offers a more detailed schematic for the learning of the lessons of individuation. Only towards the latter part of these lessons does the choice in individual free will between the polarities of STO and STS become relevant. This choice, when carried through to sufficient purity and consistency, prepares man for the next density. Just as we see that basic emotions and social organization are developed along a range of higher animal life forms, we could say that the basics of a spiritually conscious, unconditioned free will are developed during the later part of the third density. Fourth density. This is the Cassiopeian raw concept for a mode of existence between physical and ethereal. The concept is important for the present work since such a state may very well be the result of the great work of the alchemist, ascension, graduation with the wave etc. However, the concept is named. Furthermore, such a level appears to be the level at which the higher echelons of the matrix function, thus one cannot ignore the possible existence of such a level of reality when studying the deeper nature of the world. Usually in esoteric literature nothing corresponding to an intermediate level between human-type life and a purely disincarnate existence is described. The Gurdjieffian cosmology comes close to the idea of different density beings with a diagram of everything living. The category of angels, planetary beings, could well correspond to 4th density, and the category of archangels, solar beings, to 6th. The names are highly allegoric, though. We do not have a mathematical description of whatever laws might govern time and space at such a level. We do not even know with certainty whether such a level is real. People may have experienced states and perceptions which are typical of such a level, but these experiences are inherently ambiguous in the way of mystical experiences. We recognize that we are grasping at a concept of which we cannot make any complete or contradiction-free description. The existence of such a level is indirectly supported by the high strangeness related to the UFO phenomenon. Also, stories of myth speak of creatures somewhere between matter and spirit. The strangeness involves anomalies of time, passing through solid objects, places larger on the inside than outside, etc. In the Cassiopeia view of evolution of consciousness, individuals graduate from 3rd density, which corresponds to the human-like existence as we know it, to 4th density when they have completed the evolution possible in 3rd density. The chief criterion is having achieved a consistent self which is stably dedicated to either service to others or service to self. This naturally involves a certain level of knowledge and intelligence, since the two polarities cannot be discerned without. This glossary generally only summarizes channel material when referring to such. We will make an exception here, since there is very little else to go on concerning this theme. From Ra, questioner, thank you. Is it possible for you to give a short description of the conditions in the 4th density? Ra, I am Ra. We ask you to consider as we speak that there are not words for positively describing 4th density. We can only explain what is not and approximate what is. Beyond 4th density, our ability grows more limited until we become without words. That which 4th density is not, it is not of words, unless chosen. It is not of heavy chemical vehicles for body complex activities. It is not of disharmony within self. It is not of disharmony within peoples. It is not within limits of possibility to cause disharmony in any way. Approximations of positive statements. It is a plane of type of bipedal vehicle which is much denser and more full of life. It is a plane wherein one is aware of the thought of other selves. It is a plane wherein one is aware of vibrations of other selves. It is a plane of compassion and understanding of the sorrows of 3rd density. It is a plane striving towards wisdom or light. It is a plane wherein individual differences are pronounced although automatically harmonized by group consensus. From the Cassiopeians, not that simple. Picture driving to reach New Mexico by car and skipping over and arriving in San Diego instead, or driving to the grocery store in Santa Fe and winding up in Moscow instead. Now, pay attention. What if 1 on 2nd density perceives objects due to their similarity, 1 on 3rd density perceives objects due to their difference, and 1 on 4th density perceives objects in terms of their own union with all of them? I have another question. In a session from April, you made the following comment: 4-dimensional, 4th density, see? So you related 4 dimensions to 4th density. I don't know a mathematical representation of density. I know how to represent 4 dimensions. This was the first time that you related dimension to density. Is there really a relation? Yes, because 4th density is experienced in 4th dimensional reality. Speaking now about 4-dimensional reality, is it 4-dimensional reality of the Kaluza-Klein type? Visual spectrum. Does that mean that the 4th dimension is not related to the 5th dimension of the Kaluza-Klein theory? Yes. Yes, it is related. No, yes, it is not. There is a flaw in these theories, relating to prism. What does this tell you? To prism? Visual spectrum? I don't know what it tells me. I never came across any relation to prism. But, what is this 4th dimension? Is it an extra dimension beyond the 3 space dimensions, or is it a time dimension? Not time, Einstein. It is an added spatial reference. The term dimension is used simply to access the popular reference, relating to 3 dimensions. The added dimension allows one to visualize outwardly and inwardly simultaneously. When you talk about this 4th dimension, what is the closest thing in currently understood physics that corresponds to this term? I cannot find anything that corresponds. It is not in relativity theory, it is not in Einstein, it is not in Kaluza-Klein. Exactly, because it has not been hypothesized. The reader is encouraged to study the Cassiopeia and raw materials for more clues. Both discuss densities throughout the text. Within the scope of this article, we can only say that we are dealing with a fundamentally different world. Alice through the looking glass, said the Cassiopeians. It seems that 3rd density beings may visit 4th density conditions in the context of UFO abduction, for example. This does not, however, make one a 4th density being. The density to which one is native depends on development of consciousness. Additional note: the astral worlds, also known as the astral planes, astral realms or astral spheres, sometimes also known as the beyond, the afterlife, or the 4th dimension, to which people will transition soon after leaving the physical world. 4th density SDS beings. This term is used in this work to refer to beings existing at a level superior to the human level and manipulating humanity and other similar life forms for their own ends. These are the architects and ultimate controllers of the Matrix, the Moon of Gurdjieff, the Archons of Darkness of the Mystics. Most of the UFO phenomenon originates with these forces. We are not talking about strictly ethereal entities. They can appear as solid physical bodies, as exemplified by many UFO reports. These are, however, not native to physicality as experienced by humans. They occupy a realm with variable physicality and can project themselves into physicality as experienced by humans through use of technology or psychic power. The idea of these beings as a human-like life form from some other planet is misleading. The various strange anomalies such as variations in the rate of passage of time, spaces being larger on the inside than outside, and such effects suggest that these beings experience different laws of physics from what we are used to. Accounts retrieved from people having interacted with such entities suggest that people can be transported into this different level of reality and temporarily exist there in physical form. Thus that level does not appear as a fluid idea world and has a certain solidity. Also based on these observations, there are living entities as well as inanimate pieces of technology and evidence. We cannot construct an exact representation of this level based on human sensory experience. Accounts of high strangeness in conjunction of the UFO phenomenon and psychic experiences of humans, however, suggest that such a mode of being and perceiving is real. Otherwise, we are limited to descriptions contained in various channel material. Different biological types of beings have been reported in this context. Most reports concern the so-called gray alien, a somewhat humanoid 4-foot-tall creature with large black eyes and a ball-shaped head. Another form is an 8-foot-tall upright alligator, sometimes called a lizzie, yet another is a Nordic-looking human form. Still other forms such as insects are sometimes reported. To what degree these are physical forms and to what degree these are interpretations of the observers from something else is unclear. There appears to be consistency between reports describing these as solid beings. On the other hand, similar beings are seen walking through walls and materializing from thin air also. This suggests an inherent mastery of physicality, whether through technology or as an intrinsic feature of these beings. Fifth density. This term is used by the Cassiopeians to denote a non-physical state of being where entities that incarnate in first through fourth densities exist between incarnations. This is also called a recycling zone. Ra describes this as the first non-physical density or the density of wisdom, the first way thought can create reality without being bounded by material restrictions. In reading Cassiopeia transcripts, it seems that we need to distinguish between occupying fifth density as a between lives stage from being a fifth density soul. The latter would mean one which had graduated from fourth density and no longer would incarnate there. The subject is beyond our means of direct knowing. We can, however, make some general inferences on the nature of this and compare this with other material on reincarnation and afterlife. Incarnation into a density which corresponds to a soul's general level of development is a necessary means for progress. Only incarnation may teach certain indispensable lessons. We find this idea largely across the board, from Cassiopeia to Steiner. Ra explains experience as consisting of equal parts of space-time and time-space. Space-time corresponds to incarnate life, with motion in space and no control on the flow of time. Time-space corresponds to between lives contemplation, with free motion in time but no means of affecting space, so at least for third-density souls. Steiner explains the between lives state or astral world as being based on thought in the same manner as the physical world is based on matter. Time for the incarnate beings flows forward, time for the beings between lives flows in the opposite direction. Generally, Steiner sees spirit as guiding the present from the future, whereas matter reaches for the future from the past. Each moment of consciousness is thus a meeting of these two streams. Steiner describes in detail how a sort of mirroring of the past life occurs in the astral world, where one gets to see the self from the outside, through the eyes of all one has interacted with. The Cassiopeians describe fifth density as timeless, thus each between incarnation state is concurrent with every other such state. The contemplation may be instantaneous or eternal, depending on viewpoint. Fifth density may be a sort of showroom of all which may be possible, but realizing these possibilities for one's edification needs to be done from the density that is appropriate to the lesson. Distance between beings, or experiences of beings, would be a question of pure thought, where similarity measures distance. Thus, a being that is very fragmented or contradictory, i.e. is dissimilar with itself, may not even be recognizable as the same entity. So we could speak of a timeline of incarnations, simply measuring the similarity between each between incarnation state, so that successive ones are closer together than ones separated by much change of the soul. We have some relatively independent accounts of near-death experiences, many of which involve cessation of brain functioning, which we may compare with descriptions of a between-lives state. What seems to be a common feature is that near-death experiences correspond to the near-deceased person's system of beliefs. There are, for example, many accounts of meeting Jesus. There are some common features such as going to a light or passing through a tunnel. It may be that the mind structures the experience around familiar concepts. It may also be that this stage is as Steiner describes it, such that knowing of something brings one closer to that which is known, i.e. the metric of distance is informational similarity. Thus one ends up in the company of those one live with, which is often reported in near-death experiences and would explain the often proposed idea that people repeatedly incarnate as teams. One's degree of spiritual cohesiveness after each incarnation would influence how much work or learning or planning can take place between lives. Thus in cases we may have an entirely mechanical law of karma, in other cases more or less intentional life plans. Sixth density. This term is used by the Cassiopeia and raw channeled sources to denote their native state of being. Also the inspiration for the bringers of the Dawn book is according to these same sources from sixth density. Most crop circles are, according to the Cassiopeians, produced by entities of sixth density. Many so-called wanderers are souls whose home density is the sixth, but who have taken incarnation in human form for a specific mission. We cannot say much that is concrete or verifiable about this subject. Still, since the subject of sixth density relates to much of the inspiration of the present work, we must attempt to place this in some context. The archangels or solar world of the Gurdjieffian cosmology may refer to sixth density. The Dianic beings or solar beings of Steiner's cosmology may refer to sixth density. The absolute two of Moraviv, i.e. the world of all stars and the Christ, may be in some relation to sixth density. The comparisons are tentative and we can hardly produce contradiction-free or definite descriptions of this level. The sixth density or 6D is a level of non-material existence where souls have outgrown the need to incarnate in any density. Souls of first through fourth densities go through incarnations, with a contemplation period as non-material forms in fifth density in between. 6D is the last stage before union with the one, or seventh density. Seventh density would correspond to the one source of all creation, God the Father of Moraviv or the Son Absolute of Gurdjieff. As with 4D, there is still a concept of individual entities forming social memory complexes, i.e. communities where entities all share the same database of experience and understandings. The esoteric level of human development where understandings are unified through practice of objectivity and where integrity does not allow mismatch of action and understanding would be a precursor of the social memory complex of 460. Entities of this level are of a service to others' orientation as a result of natural factors. This is complex and an exact understanding of this may not be possible at our level. The point is that the idea of service to self is represented in 6D as a concept but not as whole entities. There is still a difference between concept and actuality from the 6D viewpoint. The thought and reality become only non-differentiated in 7D, but this is even farther past our capacity of description. Pure service to self, SDS, does not occur as functioning entities past 4D apparently because the inherent bias for materiality and subjectivity prevents it. A very far advanced STS entity acquires a sort of spiritual mass that causes it to fold up on itself, a bit like a black hole in the material world. If the entity let go of its defining preoccupation with control, it could become objective, but then it would no longer be an STS entity. A 6D entity lives in a world of pure thought or light and is a light form without a fixed body. The Cassiopeans once said that if two entities could access absolutely all there is, these would in fact be one, indistinguishable from each other. In this sense we could say that all is one from the 6D viewpoint, yet there still is the idea of entity. We see that the idea of objectivity is inherently linked to such a notion of living in unity of omnipresence. An entity that would only see what it wants to see would sort of collapse on itself in such a state and in fact share nothing, except its illusion with itself, which may be the reason why there is no operative SDS at that level. To be one with all, one cannot be prejudiced. Again, not being prejudiced does not mean that one cannot assign values to things or choose what one participates in. Quite the contrary. We could even say that objectivity and lack of prejudice are prerequisites of metaphysical free will. One cannot choose unless one knows. One cannot know in this sense if one thinks wishfully. We can say very little about perception of time or space of 6D. We could infer that events of the physical densities appear as from a bird's eye perspective, with different possible pasts and futures alongside each other, as a sort of tangle of threads of different probabilities. In the terms of Gurdjieffian cosmology, we could say that the 6D entity sees at least the dimensions of linear time and eternity, seeing a plane containing all possible timelines as from a height in a third dimension. The word eternity in the fourth way sense refers to a dimension perpendicular to linear time, as in the set of all possible timelines. In a sense we could say that the experience of sixth density involves 6 dimensions. Again, these are approximate visualizations. Generally, the 6D sources speak as if the past of 3D were an open book and the future a branching tangle of probabilities. In this sense it is sometimes said that time does not exist in the higher densities. This should not be taken too literally. Rather, this seems to mean that time does not appear as a one-way street with most things hidden behind a corner, as it mostly does to us. The Cassiopeans repeatedly use the term you in the future when speaking of themselves. This can be understood as referring to at least one possible future where Laura Nightjadzik, the channel, and maybe some fellow travelers have become deceased. However, there can be futures where this is not the case as well as possible pasts where no such channeling took place to begin with. The process of contact then is a link pulling certain lines of past towards certain lines of futures. The 6D experience may be akin to guiding this from a bird's eye view. Still, in a sense, the Cassiopeans are creating themselves by guiding their past selves. Yet all such metaphors are incomplete because their very language assumes linear causality which most likely does not apply in the 6D perspective. To complete this summary, we will quote Ra, in relationship to the densities. The sun body may physically, as you would say, be seen to be a large body of gaseous elements undergoing the processes of fusion and radiating heat and light. Metaphysically, the Sun achieves a meaning to 4th through 7th density according to the growing abilities of entities in these densities to grasp the living creation and co-entity, or other self, nature of this Sun body. Thus by the 6th density the Sun may be visited and inhabited by those dwelling in time-space and may even be partially created from moment to moment by the processes of 6th density entities in their evolution. In this density some entities whose means of reproduction is fusion may choose to perform this portion of experience as part of the beingness of the Sun body. Thus you may think of portions of the light that you receive as offspring of the generative expression of 6th density love. Angels. The term angel is used in a wide variety of meanings in different contexts. Generally the term means a spiritual, non-physical being that belongs to some spiritual hierarchy or performs some specific function for a higher spiritual authority such as God. An angel is generally understood as being benevolent. Theosophy, anthroposophy and various Gnostic teachings have detailed descriptions of various categories of angels, entire heavenly organization charts. Gurdjieff makes some mention of angels and archangels in the diagram of everything living. These seem to correspond to planetary and solar beings, or 4th and 6th density in the Cassiopean Ra system. The New Age movement has made angels a sort of fashion. There are books and guided meditation tapes and such for contacting one's guardian angels, communicating with angels and so forth. Much of this seems to simply stimulate people's imagination towards further wishfulness. The problem is not that genuine communication with higher beings would never take place, rather the problem is the indiscriminate approach and the assumption that one would be prepared for such by attending a weekend seminar. The Cassiopeia material defines an angel as being a 6th density SDO being. An actual direct encounter with one is, according to the source, of such a nature as to leave no doubt to its authenticity. However, 4D STS may present themselves as angels also, among other deceptions. However, 4D STS tend to give themselves away, as there seems to be a sort of spiritual law that such contacts cannot entirely disguise their nature. Violation of free will, demands of worship, flattery or cultivating a sense of chosenness for example can be signs of a negative influence. The Cassiopeia material states that humans do not have any dedicated guardian angels or such, rather all are responsible for themselves, although may receive help if they ask in the appropriate manner. Realm. This is the Cassiopean term for a division of reality. The use of the term is very broad. This includes the following meanings: density, the degree of development of a consciousness determines the general type of experience of space and time, manner of perceiving other entities etc. SDO and SDS divisions of a density, souls of different polarities may occupy distinct realms within one density. Lateral divisions within a density, as in parallel universes. Realms are bounded by a so-called frequency resonance envelope. A realm curtain or realm border is another word for a section of such an envelope. The wave is also called a realm border. On one hand, realms are naturally occurring divisions of reality, on the other hand realms are influenced by their occupants. There is a sort of resonance effect which tends to lock the resident of a realm within its boundaries in terms of frequency. A realm might be compared to a radio broadcast and the beam to a receiver. Nature provides a sort of automatic fine-tuning which will cause the receiving frequency of the beam to snap to match that of the closest realm. There may be a small reciprocal effect from the being on the realm, but this would be negligible in the individual case. A realm border could be likened to many stations broadcasting near the same frequency, so that a small change of individual tuning may cause the tuner to snap to an entirely different reality. We could say that the receiver's mental map of reality decides which broadcast can be followed and thus mentally synchronized with. The realm border is just a circumstance which brings multiple bands of reality within close reach or in overlap with each other. Passage between realms is in principle possible anytime, in some cases with technology, in other cases by attaining a somehow total purity of thought and being, aligning one to another reality. However, such a process is problematic if one has no notion of what is possible or where one may be headed, not to mention the near-invincible inertia of the human condition. A realm is neither a completely physical nor a completely consciousness-based concept. We could say that a realm is a set of partitions, a bit like a sandbox where a particular type of consciousness may experience interaction with reality. These move with respect to each other according to some cyclicity, and the consciousness itself moves between realms, for example, through reincarnation. The incarnate and disincarnate states occupy different but joint realms. Phenomena taking place at the border between realms can, according to the Cassiopeans, be technologically manipulated, which is the manner in which 4D STS beings keep a sort of net of control over the earth and enforce changes on humanity in the context of the mythical fall. We cannot describe these processes in scientifically precise terms, hence we have to use words like frequency and resonance in a somewhat allegoric meaning. The wave. In the Cassiopeia material, this is a cyclic cosmic event, slated to next take place on Earth and its environment between now and 2012. This is variously referred to as the transition to fourth density, shift of the ages, harvest, and by many other terms in many bodies of material. The idea of a cosmic event taking place in the early 21st century has been seeping into increasingly general circulation ever since the late 19th century. Gurdjieff, For instance, makes veiled references to such a thing when speaking of a time allotted for certain preparation to take place on Earth. Theosophists and Steiner also allude to such a thing. The raw material, Law of One, from the early 1980s speaks of such an event in more detail, introducing the idea of a planetary transition to fourth density. The Cassiopeia material, since 1994, picks up on the theme left by Ra and discusses the transition in more specifics. The QFS, Quantum Future School, sees the wave as a strong working hypothesis but does not claim to possess certainty on its validity or a formal definition of the concept. The QFS interpretation of the concept could be outlined as follows. The universe involves different levels of being, each inhabited by entities suited to the level. Some of these levels are in part physical, such as the one which present-day humanity inhabits. Natural processes cause the veil between these levels to periodically be thinned or breached, creating a sort of crossroads or conduit. This is a sort of superposition of many usually sealed levels of being. Outside of the natural process, there are entities which use technology or psychic capabilities for passing between levels. The UFO phenomenon is one example of this. These levels are called densities in the sea and raw materials. Other sources use other names, such as cosmoses in the fourth way literature. Sea density, cosmoses. The degree of development of a consciousness determines which level of density is natural to it. For certain esoterically developed humans, their level of being approaches the level required for inhabiting the fourth density, a level of being with a radically different perception of space, time and physicality. The natural circumstance of the wave, i.e. the narrowing of the natural gap between levels of density, thus offers a possibility of passage to those that are ready. Hence the term graduation or ascension. Polarization to either service to others, SDO, or service to self, SDS, is usually seen as the central requirement for the passage. This ties to the fourth way teaching in the sense that man must become a single, unambiguous entity before such a polarization even makes sense. Thus the fourth way work on the self is necessary in order to create a self that is solid and consistent enough to bridge the transition between densities. The wave is seen as a point of turbulence. The arrival of the wave is seen as coinciding with various cataclysmic upheavals, both in terms of society and nature. The wave has been compared to a waterfall. The river runs placidly up to the brink, then plunges down as a very turbulent stream and again settles into a riverbed of relative stability. A swimmer cannot escape the river but may make adjustments of course for avoiding rocks at the bottom of the plunge if he is aware of these. Also possibilities of a phase change, i.e. evaporation, are greater in the cloud of spray surrounding the fall. Phase change, as in passage from solid to liquid to gaseous, has been used as an analogy for shift of density. A small increment of energy causes qualitative changes in the substance and its properties. In the waterfall analogy, we note that in order to survive the plunge, one must be solid. When applied to a group of beings, as well as to the multiple the firsts of each individual, this means that these must be cohesive and aligned to a common purpose. The QFS uses the term collinearity for this when speaking of a group. When speaking of an individual, the term is fusion or having a real-life failing this quality, one is likely to be ripped apart by the turbulence and not to preserve recognizable existence. The QFS suggests that in the specific volatile circumstances corresponding to the waterfall, the quality of observation contributed to the process by the participants may make a large change in the outcome. This outcome may involve passage between densities, for example. Another example may be a split in timelines, as in the many worlds interpretation of quantum physics. Thus persons embracing one mode of being may literally end up in a different reality than other persons. The processes in question are not strictly physical, although physical chaos is one likely reflection of the wider process. The process is seen as a macrocosmic quantum jump, determined by conscious observation. Just like the observation event is needed to force a quantum system to a specific state, observation is needed to guide the events inside the wave. This is one reason for the QFS's and fourth way work's emphasis on objectivity and clarity of understanding and work on forging a real lie. Polarization to a sufficient purity of STS or SDO is not possible without knowledge of the world and the capacity for long-term, unambiguous work. Still further, a group is needed to bring the requisite scope and consistency to the observation. Failing to achieve a critical mass of SDO-oriented consciousness in time for the wave will likely cause the planet as a whole to remain in the hands of the present STS-oriented control system, divided in a third density and fourth density group, the latter feeding on the former, as has been the case throughout history. Essentially, this amounts to a rerun of Earth history, from the dawn of man up to present, until the next cyclic coming of the wave. According to the Cassiopeians, the period of the cycle is about 309,000 years. Frequency fins. This is a Cassiopeian or Pleiadian term for an artificial construct meant to include perception or keep someone's perception or FRV, frequency resonance vibration, within a particular range. The term was first used in Bringers of the Dawn and then mentioned a few times in the Cassiopeia material. The two sources seem to use the term in a similar meaning. We cannot give a precise definition of the term. We can think that consciousness has a frequency and that this frequency binds it to a realm where this frequency fits. This is similar to a radio tuner not receiving transmissions which are off the selected frequency even though their signal physically reaches the antenna. The frequencies to which the receiver is not tuned are invisible, as it were. A frequency fence is a structure which keeps receivers and transmitters it affects tuned to a certain band. The idea is insidious in that the frequencies that one cannot access for all intents and purposes do not exist. Thus it is difficult or impossible to prove the existence of such a thing, especially from inside it. The effects of such a thing would greatly vary depending on the affected person's natural tendencies. If one naturally stays within the fence, one need never become aware of it. Further, distinguishing artificial limitation from natural limitation is problematical. In practical terms, a frequency fence may manifest as any artificial control on emotion, however, usually tending away from consciousness, towards indifference or depression or towards chaotic activity or obsessive preoccupation. The only defense against such can come from awareness of the possibility of the fence and of knowing oneself. Having these, one can use will to combat the effects of the fence or to avoid situations where it is felt the most. We note that this need not be a planet-wide situation in all cases. The effects may be localized or be transmitted through particular people. The Waves and Adventures series at the Cassiopeia site discuss many unusual effects that may be linked to a phenomenon of this sort. Saying anything conclusive is next to impossible, but the idea of electromagnetically influencing the mind is well demonstrated. Thus there is corroboration for the general concept, although its hyperdimensional aspects are not fully understood. From Bringers of the Dawn, it was like corporate trading on Wall Street. These creator gods raided Earth approximately 300,000 years ago, the time period, historically speaking, that we would call the beginning of human civilization. When this skirmish occurred, a certain group of entities fought in space and won the territory of Earth. These new owners did not want the native Earth species, the humans, to be informed of what took place. Uninformed, the species would be easier to control. This is why light is information and darkness is lack of information. These entities beat out light, and Earth became their territory. It gives you a new idea of light, does it not? There was great radioactivity and nuclear action, and much of Earth was rent asunder. The original species, human creation, experienced great destruction and was scattered. These new creator gods, who were the new owners, were also master geneticists. They understood how to create life, and they wanted this territory for their own reasons. Territories are created and held by certain energies for many reasons, one of which is that there is consciousness within all things. Consciousness communicates continuously. Consciousness vibrates, or can be led to vibrate, at certain electromagnetic frequencies. Electromagnetic energies of consciousness can be influenced to vibrate in a certain way to create a source of food. Just as apples can be prepared and eaten in a variety of ways, consciousness can be prepared and ingested in a variety of ways. Some entities, in the process of their own evolution, began to discover that as they created life and put consciousness into things through modulating the frequencies of forms of consciousness, they could feed themselves, they could keep themselves in charge. They began to figure out that this is how Prime Creator nourished itself. Prime Creator sends out others to create an electromagnetic frequency of consciousness as a food source for itself. The new owners of this planet had a different appetite and different preferences than the former owners. They nourished themselves with chaos and fear. These things fed them, stimulated them, and kept them in power. These new owners who came here 300,000 years ago are the magnificent beings spoken of in your Bible, in the Babylonian and Sumerian tablets, and in texts all over the world. They came to Earth and rearranged the native human species. They rearranged your DNA in order to have you broadcast within a certain limited frequency band whose frequency could feed them and keep them in power. Anything of DNA that was unnecessary for survival and that could keep you informed was unplugged, leaving you with only a double helix that would lock you into controllable, operable frequencies. A frequency fence, something like an electrical fence, was put around the planet to control how much the frequencies of humans could be modulated and changed. As the story goes, this frequency fence made it very difficult for the frequencies of light information to penetrate. End quote. Frequency resonance vibration. FRV stands for frequency resonance vibration and is a term specific to the Cassiopeia material. The term frequency generally means the number of repetitions of a repeating event within a period of time. The word vibration generally refers to an oscillating, repeating motion. Resonance occurs when a vibration in one system triggers a vibration of the same frequency in another system. Systems can have one or more resonant frequencies, at which frequencies they have a tendency to vibrate. In common New Age parlance, vibration or vibe means a sort of psychic impression, the feel of a person or situation. High frequency connotates goodness or spiritual value, low frequency is dirty, unclear, sticky, vulgar, maybe violent and selfish. One feels a resonance or resonates with something when this something, whether person or information, somehow feels right or true or personally relevant. In the Cassiopeia material, FRV is a property of a person that has to do with the person's alignment or intrinsic nature. FRV can tend towards service to others or service to self. FRV is itself not immutable. The FRV of a person may change as a result of influences. If a person is in proximity to another who has a different FRV, there can occur forced resonance where the two start resonating at the same frequency. Still, one has a constitutional predisposition to resonate at some frequencies more than at others. FRV is not directly coupled to knowledge or intellectual capacity. Still, knowledge and intellectual capacity facilitate work on one's FRV. They allow one to discern between STS and STO and to make corresponding choices, thus heading towards one or the other end. FRV is essentially an indication of an emotional path. It is possible that the terms of frequency and vibration have a literal meaning in a hyperdimensional context involving a person's alignment with the thought center. If this is so, the phenomenon is not perceived by us in this manner, except allegorically.